You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, recording from Washington, D.C., Ankit Panda.
I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, and I am still in Hawaii.
Still very jealous, Katie, but I hope you're enjoying your time out in the middle of the Pacific. How's it going so far?
It's beautiful as always. It's a wonderful place.
Well, I think that, sets us up pretty nicely to, talk about the view from Washington to the Pacific, quite literally, as we turn this week, as I indicated in our last episode, to talk a little bit more in detail about the Biden administration's newly released Indo-Pacific strategy report. And so I think the place to maybe start is to just first of all explain, why American administrations bother releasing these kinds of documents, right? A strategy document, I mean, obviously it's great fodder for analysts and podcasters like us to spend lots of time talking about these things. But more broadly, it's a way to sort of signal one's strategic thinking, right? If a strategy is understood as matching sort of limited means to finite ends, then it is worth new administrations basically setting out what the ends that they seek to accomplish are and what the means by which they expect to accomplish those means are. And so the Biden administration has tried to do this in its 19-page Indo-Pacific strategy document. And so, Katie, I was thinking today we just maybe share a few impressions, first of all, at a very high level. And then I sort of wanted to kind of go through the document a little bit, not in tremendous detail, but to sort of, give our listeners who maybe don't have the time to read the entire thing sort of a read-along, so to speak. So if that sounds good to you, I was maybe going to turn it over to you to maybe kick us off with what you sort of took away at the highest level from this Indo-Pacific strategy.
Absolutely. That sounds like a great plan, and I think very useful. So the thing that jumped out at me most prominently is the focus throughout the strategy on allies and partners. And it mentions these in kind of three different groups. I would say you've got your treaty allies. The United States has a number of those in Asia, sort of partners that are not treaty allies, but are in that same universe of partners. And then organizations like ASEAN, the Pacific Islands, PIF. Oh, I just blanked on the name of it.
Pacific Islands Forum.
Pacific Islands Forum. Forum's the word. Sorry about that. My apologies to the Pacific. But even that earns a mention in this, which I think is different from maybe past documents. And so that focus on allies and partners kind of, I think, sets up the rest of the document as kind of a network strategy. It's not that the United States is going to do all of these things on its own. It's sort of, we want to do these things and we want all of these partners to assist us in this. I mean, even NATO gets a mention. There's, I think, an interesting discussion to be had about, France gets a shout out. There's a focus on bringing in the United States as allies and partners from around the world into Asia, with the backing that Asia is extremely important to the rest of the world and extremely important to U.S. Goals in the rest of the world. And so I think that's kind of an interesting way to avoid the abandoning Europe to focus on Asia angle by saying, like, Europe, come along with us to Asia. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what top line things you pulled out of this document.
Well, so, I'm gonna share a few thoughts on the China piece of this, which I thought was really interesting and actually a pretty important contrast with the Trump administration, I think. There's been sort of this genre of analysis that the Biden folks have really just picked up on the Trump administration's China policy. But I think we actually see in the Indo-Pacific strategy that there's a pretty important difference in how they're thinking about this. But before I get to that, Katie, I mean, let me just, briefly just expand on what you said. I mean, I think the folks writing this document, I mean, first of all, I think there's a serious interest in the Biden administration to really, really indicate that the America First era is over, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Biden campaigned on this. He emphasized that he would rebuild alliances and partnerships if he was elected. And so I think the emphasis throughout, which I completely agree with you on allies and partners, is just incredibly stark, is an attempt to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also an element of continuity with sort of, where the Obama administration left off in 2016. I think a lot of the language on networking between alliances and partnerships, pursuing trilateralism with Japan and South Korea, we could even relate that back to the older 2016 era concept that the Ash-Carter Pentagon was quite big on, of a principled security network in Asia. Mm-hmm. This was sort of, this predates the Indo-Pacific, but I think, that concept, I think really, at least the DNA of that, the intellectual heritage there, I think really sort of comes through to me in this document. But let me just, shift gears now to China. So, look, I think one of the tensions and frustrations that some folks, especially in Asia, had with the Trump administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific was that, did the Trump administration have an Indo-Pacific strategy for China, or did the administration really have a China strategy for the Indo-Pacific, right? And I think those things are not exactly the same thing. And I think the sense was with all of the emphasis on great power competition and, critiquing the Chinese Communist Party versus talking about the PRC's external behavior and really framing a lot of what the administration was doing in the Indo-Pacific in terms of China. Smaller countries, middle powers, organizations like ASEAN were sort of seen as a sideshow. And I think the Biden administration sort of tried to flip that and really come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy for China, which I think really kind of comes through in this document. That said, China is, I think, at the center of this strategy in many ways. I mean, in the executive summary section at the start of this document on the Indo-Pacific's promise, there's two pretty long paragraphs dedicated to all the bad things that China is doing. The administration offers its theory of why China is problematic, which is that China is basically using all means of national powers to pursue, quote, a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and seeks to become the world's most influential power. So there's a clear theory here. China's trying to become a hegemon in ways that are detrimental to American interests and peace and security in the Indo-Pacific, so we're going to try to prevent that. But the fact that the Chinese Communist Party isn't mentioned in the document, I think, is pretty important to flag, right? Because I think the Trump administration was approaching competition with China with a more expansive lens, where they were critiquing the CCP, critiquing Chinese internal practices in a way that, to Chinese leaders, implied potentially that the United States would not simply stop at trying to constrain China's behavior in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Western Pacific, and so forth, but actually that the U.S. might want to change China internally. And to Chinese leaders, that concern is existential. It amounts to sort of regime change language, I think, and in sort of the worst manifestation of that. And so, looking at the Biden document, it's pretty interesting to see, like, literally explicitly, about the quote from the document, that they say, our objective is not to change the PRC, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates. And so that's, I think, the clearest kind of statement in my mind that this administration is coming at the Indo-Pacific more from the perspective of coming up with an Indo-Pacific strategy for China, that how is this region going to evolve, and what can the United States do to sort of steer this region in a way that's going to make it more difficult for China to accomplish its objectives. And so, the administration has a separate China strategy, and that's a much more sort of global approach with sort of facets ranging from Latin America to Europe to Africa, all around the world. And so, that really jumped out to me. And I think without sort of de-emphasizing the CCP, I think the administration would sort of have a very difficult time basically saying that they're going to engage in, quote, responsible competition with China, which has been sort of the theme since late 2021 when Biden met Xi and the two of them talked about guardrails to preventing conflict. So that really jumped out to me. I don't know if you had a similar set of impressions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the document makes clear that China is a challenge in the Pacific. That doesn't make it the only challenge, and so I think and we'll get into this more as we go through the document. It didn't want. It was pretty clear to me that they didn't want this document to just be about China, because while China is obviously a massive issue in the Pacific, it is far from the only issue that the countries of the Pacific care about. And so I think by saying, like, yes, it's a yes and climate change and development and some of these other issues that we'll get into. And so I think that's obviously an important facet, and I'm glad that you picked up on that one.
Mm-hmm. So let's maybe start kind of going through this. So, ahead of this discussion, I sort of went through and marked up this document. We're obviously not going to have time to go through the entire thing, but I thought, I could maybe flag a couple things and you could do the same. So, actually, I've been going back to the piece on allies and partners. There's this really interesting section at the start of the second section of the document where the drafters really point out where the U.S. overlaps with specific allies and partners. So, they say, like Japan, we believe in X. Like India, we want this. Like Australia, we want this. Like South Korea, we want this. Like ASEAN, we want this. So there's this real emphasis on pointing out that, these interests are shared. It's not sort of the U.S. imposing a certain vision on the Indo-Pacific to countries in the region. And even when they address, the United Kingdom, France, the European Union, it's sort of a very similar approach. So, I thought that was pretty interesting. Going down, Katie, we've talked about this a little bit, including on the last episode. I'm wondering what you made of the language on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is something that is, part of the action plan. It hasn't yet been released. It's very much anticipated. This has been sort of a chronic sort of criticism that the Trump administration and the Biden administration have received, which is that the U.S. is sort of hopping on one leg in the Indo-Pacific, primarily relying on diplomacy and military capabilities, but less on sort of meeting the economic demand signals from the region. So, what was your sense on how the strategy document addresses this?
Yeah, I mean the economic piece is certainly a big complaint that I've heard from a lot of people who have comments, and it mentions an economic framework that is TBD, and in doing that, kind of throws out the grab bag of possible technological transformation, digital economy, energy, climate, sort of all of these things are ostensibly part of that discussion. Further down in the document, when it gets into sort of the action plan items, leading on an Indo-Pacific economic framework is one of those action items. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we as observers should be watching the administration for in the next, they say 24 or 12 to 24 months. So the next 2 years is the plan to have something like this. They say, we're going to launch this in early 2022. They refer to it as a new partnership. So I imagine we need to start looking for meetings regarding this partnership and who's going to be involved. I do think, not that I was expecting anybody to kind of bring up the TPP, but how this new economic framework will fit in with existing economic frameworks that the United States had been a part of and pulled out of, and doesn't seem to be re-entering. But maybe we're wrong. I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch, is how whatever this proposed new architecture is, how that interacts with existing. So CPTPP is what it's called now, plus our CEP. And so, I think we'll see how that kind of fits into existing architectures.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of details in this document, nor clearly it's not that they don't have the details. They haven't had the discussions, I don't think. At least they have not ready to talk about them publicly.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the Indo-Pacific, I think they recognize the fact that everybody in the region wants to have the U.S. engaged economically, and so I think the paragraph
Absolutely.
and the language is really just letting people hear the things they want to hear. But you're absolutely right, right? I mean, everything that the language on the economic partnership, the economic framework in this document says, the U.S. could really do by just signing up to the CPTPP tomorrow. Right. I mean, I don't think this is a particularly delicate or nuanced issue. That if the U.S. really wanted to do a lot of this, join the CPTPP. Of course, here we get into the real problem for this administration, and I think for folks involved in national security policymaking in the Indo-Pacific and thinking more strategically about these issues, is they have to contend with the reality that both major parties in the United States are effectively out of the free trade business. It's not something the U.S. does anymore. It's not something that an American president will be rewarded for at the polls, certainly. It's certainly Joe Biden doesn't have the political capital to gamble on joining CPTPP. So it's this sort of odd reality where, you'll talk to folks in D.C. and they'll basically acknowledge that, yeah, it would be great if we were in TPP, because TPP would have done all of these things that would have met many of these objectives we have. But we're not going to do that because, can't convince the president that that's a good idea for domestic political
Can the
reasons.
U.S. join TPP without joining TPP is kind of the question.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's going to be difficult. I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of this framework when it comes out. I think it's going to be very heavy on like supply chains, 5G infrastructure, a lot of the non-trade components. But ultimately, I think it's still going to be, one of the biggest questions, I think, is imagining the alternate reality where maybe the 2016 election goes differently and a President Hillary Clinton reneges on her campaign promise not to join the TPP, but actually does join the TPP. But it's I think going to be a pretty tricky issue for the administration to navigate, at least honestly. So I can see why the document says what it says, but I think there's going to be continuing skepticism about the economic piece of a lot of this.
Yeah, and a slightly related economic issue is that a lot of the things mentioned in this document are going to require funding. I think that's something Prashant mentioned in our last podcast, and it's not quite clear whether that'll just be money shifted from other programs or new, or how all that's done. And a lot of that is also going to depend on U.S. domestic policy making and how budgets are made. But like, people in the Pacific know that if you want to do all these things, it takes money.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe kind of flipping things on the head now and maybe moving away from economics to talk a little bit about deterrence. As part of the action plan piece of the document, so for listeners who haven't seen the document, it sort of culminates in this Indo-Pacific action plan outlining sort of 10 objectives that the administration is going to pursue over the next 12 to 24 months. And there's a piece in there on reinforcing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Deterring military aggression against the United States, allies, and partners, including in the Taiwan Strait. And so looking at that paragraph, there's a little bit in there on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and the Maritime Security Initiative, which is to be expected, but that's just one sentence. And then the rest of it is really about AUKUS, which I found pretty interesting. And I think it's illustrative of, the extent to which I think AUKUS is going to be really, I think, a primary legacy issue of this administration in the Indo-Pacific. I think safe to say, regardless of whether Biden's a one-term or two-term president, AUKUS is, I think, at least right now, being seen as one of the things that will be this administration's major contribution to what the U.S. is seeking to do. So, I thought that was pretty interesting, Katie. And I think maybe that also gets into what you brought up earlier about the emphasis more broadly on the Southern Pacific and the Pacific Islands. I mean, it's just, I think, part of the Indo-Pacific that this administration is thinking about a little differently. I'm wondering if you want to expand a little bit on that, though. What really jumped out to you about the South Pacific focus?
Yeah, so another one of those action items is partner to build resilience in the Pacific Islands. I found this particularly interesting because I work with a lot of our writers at The Diplomat who cover the Pacific Islands in Australia. It is interesting how little the United States sometimes seems to engage in the Pacific itself. And so this focus, it's mentioned numerous times in the document. The United States will work to engage more diplomatically in the Pacific Islands. When Blinken was in Fiji, it came out that the United States is going to reopen its embassy in the Solomon Islands, which closed in the mid-90s. It was downgraded to a consulate. And so I think, and it's mentioned elsewhere in the document, that there will be a focus on opening new embassies and consulates in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific specifically. Pacific specifically is really hard to say. I think that is, I think that's really long overdue in one way, sort of re-engaging. If you think about it, the U.S. Embassy in Fiji serves Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu. The U.S. Embassy in Papua New Guinea serves not only Papua New Guinea, but Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. So there's a lot of these small island countries that just don't have a lot of U.S. diplomatic engagement. So I think watching for more of that will be interesting. Obviously, the reasons behind that are kind of two-pronged. China is a very big one. Solomon Islands recently, I guess it was 2019, switched its diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to Beijing. And the other sort of major facet is climate change. These Pacific Islands are sort of the most, the impacts of climate change are most readily apparent in Pacific Islands in terms of rising sea levels, increasing storm severity, while these countries also contribute negligible amounts to, the instigators of climate change. And so those are the two focuses when sort of, I'm going to say the word pivoting towards more focus on the Pacific Islands is addressing the China challenge, but also addressing climate change. And then baked into that, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on the compacts of free association negotiations, but those are agreements that the United States has with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and Palau, that are sort of a closer relationship than we have with other Pacific Islands. And those are all, the current agreements expire in 2023 and 2024. So, those negotiations need to make progress or they're going to go away.
Yeah. And I think that was on the Compacts of Free Association. That was something that the Trump administration began to pick up on in late 2019 and 2020 as well. So I think there's an element of slight continuity there. So can we talk a little bit about Taiwan?
Yes, we should talk about Taiwan.
So
Taiwan pops up a lot in this document.
Yeah, it does, which is not particularly surprising. I actually So my sense is that the document is actually fairly restrained on what it says about Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan appears in the list of partners alongside, India, Vietnam, and so forth. Sort of emphasizing the fact that Taiwan is not a formal treaty ally of the United States, although the U.S.
Hmm.
has a primarily congressionally led relationship with Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act. But one of the things that's interesting is, last year there was, I think, some folks were surprised when I believe it was Eli Ratner, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Pentagon, in testimony, cited preventing the unification of Taiwan with China as a core U.S. strategic interest, and that traditionally
Hmm.
is not the way in which American officials talk about, you know, Taiwan policy. A Taiwan policy in the United States is basically maintaining the cross-strait status quo. But when we get to the Indo-Pacific Strategy document, we very much see that sort of traditional framing of Taiwan. Maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and supporting Taiwan's self-defense capabilities, ensuring that an environment in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully in accordance with the wishes and best interests of Taiwan's people. So the document does not rule out the prospect of a peaceful unification scenario, which traditionally
Hmm.
the U.S. has been willing to tolerate, although realistically that's not about to happen anytime soon. And then the document again, reiterates U.S. commitment to the One China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act, and the three communiques and the six assurances, sort of the baseline
Hmm.
for American policy towards Taiwan. So I thought this was an interesting attempt to sort of ground American Taiwan policy in sort of a very traditional way, but also continue to emphasize that Taiwan is going to be a much bigger part of what the U.S. is looking to do, and the fact that Taiwan is, I think, going to be multilateralized. The U.S. is going to bring it up with all of its allies and partners, as the Biden administration started doing last year. So that I thought
Hmm.
was, again, a pretty interesting thing to see in this document.
Yeah, so certainly Taiwan gets a number of I just checked. It's 8 references, most of them in that paragraph that you just sort of cited that lays out the baseline of really U.S. relations with Taiwan. But you can kind of see how Taiwan, in being listed as a leading regional partner that the United States is going to work with, and sandwiched between Singapore and Vietnam in the list. The United States certainly sees Taiwan's role in the rest of these other initiatives, which I think reflects interestingly about what has changed and what hasn't changed about that relationship.
Right. So I think maybe, to close out today's discussion, I think maybe the last thing to talk about is architecture issues, right? So the focus on ASEAN, ASEAN centrality, emphasizing ASEAN's importance to the Indo-Pacific. Something that I think the Trump administration did, the Obama administration certainly did, and I think we're seeing that again. It's sort of the traditional approach to the pivot, for instance, in the Obama administration was, the pivot was commonly described as a pivot to Southeast Asia, and I think in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy, some of that heritage again I think shines through with the talk about ASEAN. The Quad is pretty interesting, right? Because I mean, look, nobody's calling the Quad a quadrilateral security dialogue anymore. I was sort of trying to look at the last time the Biden administration used that phrase, which is what it was called when the Quad reconvened for the first time in 10 years in November 2017 under the Trump administration. But now the Quad is, pretty explicitly being sort of desecuritized. That the Quad is doing, vaccines, climate change, infrastructure, space, and setting up scholarships, and all these things that I think this administration is really trying to emphasize has very little to do with security and defense. We talked a little bit about AUKUS, so I'm not going to revisit that. But all of this again, I think, sort of maybe dovetails with what you highlighted at the onset, Katie, about the administration really trying to bring in all of these institutional arrangements into the Indo-Pacific in a bigger way. I'm curious if anything else jumped out to you on the institutional piece.
Yeah, no, you pretty much covered it. When you're going through the action items, they hit on major sort of groupings that the United States can kind of tap into. So there's ASEAN as the obvious one, and comes, I think, first in that list. And then the Quad also. I think that's a really astute observation that when you're reading the Deliver on the Quad action item, security is not the theme, or at least traditional sort of security and defense is not the theme of that. It talks more about global health security, vaccine distribution, some on technological issues, emerging tech, but then announces a quad fellowship for 100 students from the 4 quad countries to study STEM in the United States. So that's sort of a more of a human security approach, I thought, and that fits in well, because I think the overarching conclusion is that there's a lot to do in the Pacific and a lot to get done, and the United States isn't going to be able to do all of that by itself, and so is hoping to kind of recruit, as the saying goes, partners and allies in those endeavors, and in the overarching free and open Indo-Pacific concept, and so whether these things get done and at what time scale, and whether Congress funds the things that the administration wants to be funded, are all open questions. But we now have sort of a strategy document on which we can kind of benchmark what the administration does going forward.
All right, so I think we'll leave it there. That's not every piece of this, but I hope listeners found that useful as sort of a way to parse through how the administration here is thinking about the Indo-Pacific. So, Katie, I guess I'll let you get back to the wonderful beaches of Hawaii. So thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you, as always.
And we'll be back soon with another episode, but probably when you're back in Washington. So
yeah, I'll be back in Washington. Unfortunately, I have to go home at some point.
All right. Thanks for joining me, Katie. Talk to you soon. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can subscribe really anywhere you get your podcasts. We're pretty much available at most distribution outlets. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. That really helps get the word out about the show, and we do appreciate it. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.